It happened so fast that most people around me didn't even register what they'd just seen. One second there was a little girl standing on the pavement, clutching a tiny Union Jack flag, smiling at the guard in his bearskin hat. And the next second, a sharp crack of sound. Her head snapped to the side. The flag fell, and she didn't make a sound, not right away. She just stood there blinking like her brain hadn't caught up to what her face had just felt. I'd been standing maybe 6 feet away. I saw the whole thing. And what happened next, what the guard did, I still think about it, even now. It was a Tuesday morning in late October. One of those London days where the sky can't decide what it wants to do. Overcast, mostly. A thin layer of cloud covering the sun, but enough pale light pushing through to keep things from feeling completely gray. The kind of day where you wear a light jacket and immediately regret it, then warm up just enough not to go back inside for a heavier one. I'd come to the palace that morning with no particular plan. I'm not a tourist, technically. I've lived in London for going on 11 years, and I work near Victoria, so Buckingham Palace is part of the landscape for me. I walk past it the way locals do, head down, minding my business, not stopping to look unless something catches my eye. But that morning, I'd left the house early and had time to burn before a meeting. So I crossed through St. James's Park and stopped along the front railings to drink my coffee and just stand there for a few minutes. There were tourists, of course. There are always tourists. A school group from what sounded like somewhere in Germany, all matching orange lanyards and backpacks. A Japanese couple taking photographs at precise, considered angles. A family that I'd clocked a few minutes earlier, mother, father, 2 kids, who were up close to the railings, trying to get the children near enough to see the guard properly. The younger child was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 5, maybe 6 at most. Small for her age, with dark curly hair pulled into 2 uneven bunches, wearing a pink coat with wooden buttons. She had one of those cheap plastic Union Jack flags that the souvenir shops sell in bundles, the kind on a short white stick. She was waving it enthusiastically at nothing in particular, in the way small children wave things, not for any audience, just because waving felt good. Her brother, a few years older, was pressed against the railing trying to get a photo on what looked like a parent's phone. Their father was crouched behind the boy, guiding the camera angle. Their mother was standing just slightly apart, scrolling something on her own phone, occasionally looking up. The guard on post that morning was positioned at the far-right sentry box, the one nearest to the gate on the south side. He was doing what they always do, standing perfectly still. Eyes forward, face completely neutral, bearskin hat sitting so precisely it looked like it had been placed with a ruler. His red tunic was immaculate. His boots reflected the pale morning light. I'd looked at him briefly when I first stopped, the way you look at anything that's just part of the scene. Then I turned my attention to my coffee and watched the park traffic instead. A jogger, 2 women with a pram, a man throwing breadcrumbs to pigeons who hadn't asked for his help. I wasn't paying close attention to anyone in particular when it happened. What I noticed first wasn't the slap itself. It was the sound. That specific horrible sound, flat and hard, like a book dropped on a wooden floor. Except it wasn't a book, and it wasn't a floor. I turned instinctively. The little girl in the pink coat was standing completely still, facing slightly away from me, and her head was at that wrong angle, not bent in pain yet, just displaced, like something had redirected her without asking permission. Her mother was already looking up from her phone. Her father was rising from his crouch. The older boy still had the phone raised, frozen. And standing directly behind the little girl was a man I hadn't noticed before. He was in his 40s, I'd say, heavy build, wearing a dark green waterproof jacket and carrying a camera bag over one shoulder. Tourist by the look of him, nothing obviously sinister, but his face in that moment was ugly with irritation. The kind of entitlement that doesn't bother hiding itself. From what I pieced together afterwards, the little girl had apparently stepped back without looking and bumped into him, possibly knocking against his camera bag or his leg. He'd reacted. He'd reacted by slapping a 5-year-old across the face. The girl still hadn't made a sound. And then the sound came delayed, like thunder after lightning, a long, rising wail that started thin and built into something that seemed too big for her small body to contain. Her mother reached her in seconds, gathered her up, turning her away from the man, pressing the girl's face into her shoulder. I could see the mother's face over the child's head, white, shaking, that particular expression of shock that happens before anger has had a chance to arrive. The father had stepped forward. He was saying something to the man. His voice was low and controlled, but his hands were tight fists at his sides. The man in the green jacket said something back. He gestured, dismissive, impatient, like this was all an inconvenience he hadn't asked for. A small crowd had already started to gather. The way it always does in London, not dramatically, not in a rush, just people stopping and turning and recalibrating their direction, drawn by the universal signal of a child crying and adults in confrontation. I had stopped moving entirely. My coffee was in my hand and I wasn't drinking it. And then I noticed the guard. He was still at his post, still standing in position, face forward. But something had changed. I couldn't have explained it precisely if you'd asked me right then. He hadn't moved. His posture was technically identical, but something in the quality of his stillness had shifted. The way the air around a person changes when they stop being passive and become alert. The way an animal becomes perfectly quiet right before it acts. His eyes had moved. Not dramatically, not in a way a casual observer would notice, but I was watching him by that point and I saw it. His gaze had tracked to the situation. He had registered what had just happened, and he was assessing. That's the only word I have for it. I remember thinking, quite clearly, he's going to do something. I remember also thinking, he can't. They're not allowed. They don't leave the post, they don't get involved, they don't engage. That's the whole point. The discipline is the point. The stillness is the point. Every story you hear about Buckingham Palace guards reinforces the same rule: they maintain position. They do not break for anything. It's a point of institutional pride. Except, the father and the man in the green jacket were now closer together. The father had taken one step forward and the man had responded by not stepping back. Instead, his chest had lifted, his jaw had set. The kind of body language that once you've seen it enough, you recognize as the moment before something gets physical. The little girl was still crying into her mother's shoulder. And the guard stepped off the post. I want to be very clear about this because I know how it sounds. He didn't run, he didn't shout. There was no dramatic moment of him abandoning position in some cinematic charge. It was controlled, deliberate. 3 measured steps forward, bringing him to the edge of his sanctioned area, close enough to the scene to be undeniably present without having technically crossed into civilian space. And then he spoke. I don't know what I expected from a Buckingham Palace guard who had been standing completely silent for God knows how long. Something formal, maybe, something ceremonial, an authoritative booming command. His voice was quiet. That was the first thing that surprised me. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. There's something about a perfectly controlled voice in the middle of a tense scene that cuts through everything else in a way shouting simply can't. Every head in the immediate area turned. He looked directly at the man in the green jacket. He said, and I am telling you exactly what I heard, he said, "Sir, I need you to step away from the family." That was it, no elaboration, no threat, no formal royal guard phrasing from a script. Just that sentence said quietly by a man in full ceremonial uniform with his shoulders back and his eyes absolutely steady. The man in the green jacket stared at him. I think he was doing the same calculation everyone else was doing, processing the reality of what was happening, which was that a Buckingham Palace guard, a person famous across the world for not doing anything, had just spoken to him, directly, and was now waiting for a response. For a moment it hung there. The crying had faded to hiccuping sniffles. The crowd was completely silent. The man said something, I didn't catch it, something dismissive, some attempt to reassert that this was nothing, that the child had walked into him, that he didn't see why. The guard simply repeated himself. Step away from the family, sir. Same volume, same steadiness, not louder, just repeated, like he had all the time in the world and was going to keep saying it until the situation resolved. Something in the man's posture collapsed. Not dramatically, there was no sudden surrender, no hands raised, but the chest came down, the jaw softened, the calculation visibly shifted. He muttered something, adjusted his camera bag on his shoulder, and walked away. The crowd exhaled. I actually heard it, that collective breath releasing. And then something else happened that I hadn't expected. The guard, before returning to his post, turned slightly toward the family. Not fully, not breaking his bearing, just enough to direct his attention at the mother and the little girl. He looked at the little girl for a moment. She turned slightly from her mother's shoulder. Children are always more curious than adults about what's happening around them. She was looking at him with that open, red-eyed, hiccuping post-cry look that children have, completely unguarded, taking him in. He gave her a small nod. Not a smile, his face remained composed as it has to, but the nod was unmistakable, deliberate, an acknowledgement, and I see you. The little girl stared at him for another second. And then, very slowly, she raised her tiny Union Jack flag and waved it at him. One small wave, the same enthusiastic flag wave she'd been doing before any of this happened. The guard held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned, took his 3 measured steps back to position, and was still again. The crowd took a minute to disperse. People lingered the way they do after something unexpected, reluctant to leave before they've fully processed it, checking each other's faces for confirmation that they all saw what they think they saw. The German school group had clustered nearby. A few of the teenagers had their phones out. I didn't know whether they'd filmed it or when they'd started recording, but I suspected at least some of what happened was on camera somewhere. The father stood for a while looking at the guard, who was back to facing forward, eyes on the middle distance, bearskin hat unshifted, boots planted. Like those 3 steps had never happened. Then the father turned and went back to his family. He said something to his wife, low, and she nodded. He crouched down to the little girl's level and said something to her. She showed him her flag. He laughed, a short, surprised sound, slightly cracked at the edges. The kind of laugh that isn't really about something being funny. They stayed for a few more minutes. Before they left, the mother turned and looked at the guard one more time. She didn't wave or speak. She just looked. Then she took both children by the hand and walked away. I stayed a bit longer than I needed to. Not watching anything in particular. Just standing there with my cold coffee, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not exactly moved, not in the theatrical way the word usually implies, but something quieter than that. Something like being reminded of a thing I'd half forgotten. I've thought about it a lot since then. People have strong opinions about the ceremonial guard. Some find the whole institution a bit absurd, grown men in tall fur hats standing outside a palace like an exhibit. Others see it as living history, tradition, continuity. I've never had a strong feeling either way. But that morning, I understood something about what those men are actually doing. It's not theater, or rather, it's not only theater. Underneath all the ceremony, underneath the trained stillness and the perfect posture and the rules about never breaking position, there are people. People who are paying attention. People who are watching. That guard saw a child get struck. He assessed the situation. He made a decision. And the decision he made wasn't the expected one. It wasn't to maintain position and let the world deal with its own problems, which would have been entirely defensible, entirely within the rules. The decision he made was quieter than that, more human than that. He took 3 steps and said 11 words and changed the entire shape of that moment. That's not nothing. I don't know that guard's name. I don't know anything about him, where he's from, how long he's served, what he thought about on the bus home that evening. For all I know, he'd forgotten the incident by the time he went off shift. But I remember his face when he looked at that little girl with the flag. And I remember her face when she waved it at him. Some things don't need a grand stage or a news headline or a viral video to matter. Some things just matter because they happened, and a few people were standing close enough to witness them, and they walked away from it carrying something small and true. That Tuesday morning, a little girl was slapped outside a palace. And a guard who wasn't supposed to move, moved. That's the whole story. That's enough.